As I've been scouting for the 2013 NFL Draft, one of my favorite players, one of the players that has jumped out to me the most, that I've latched onto and I said, that's one of the Schleg Daddy's guys, is Tavon Austin, the wide receiver from West Virginia. He had a phenomenal 2012 campaign as part of that high-powered, yet not particularly winning a lot of games, West Virginia offense. And barely toed that 500 mark by the end of the year. But when I look at Tavon Austin, and you look at the way the NFL game is changing and evolving, he has a lot of things that you're looking for out of the wide receiver position that you really like. He has very good speed. He also has good quickness. He has just kind of that knack to be a playmaker. He has that playmaking ability, that intangible. Some players with speed and quickness don't have that ability to make plays and make big plays at critical times. And from what I saw out of Austin the past 2 years, he does. I also like the fact that he seems to play with at least a bit of an attitude at times. He's not afraid of contact. He's willing to take it on, which could be a negative in the NFL, but I like that attitude out of him. He has that kind of don't quit attitude, and I happen to like that. And he also could be somebody that impacts the game in another way via the return game, especially as a punt returner. Now, when you look at Tavon Austin, you see a guy that's only 5'9", maybe 5'8". So size is going to be, a question. A lot of teams that are drafting high will sit there and say, do we really want to spend a high first-round pick on a guy that's only 5'9"? Especially at wide receiver. They question whether or not he's going to be able to hold up, whether he's going to be durable enough. And these are legitimate questions. Now, obviously, in the type of system that he played in, he also, could use some work on his route running. Some teams, for whatever reason, really value run blocking out of their wide receivers. So these are some of the things on the flip side, on the negative side, that are going to be held against Tavon Austin. They're going to look at him maybe as the product of a system, and combining that with his size and questions about how he's going to hold up at that size at the NFL level, some teams are going to knock him down the draft board a little bit more than maybe necessarily where his talent might suggest. But the ultimate question to me is, and I've been talking about this in the past few mock draft videos I've done, I've been moving Tavon Austin higher and higher up the board, and started really in the 20s, and it just slowly progressed its way up. I've been towards the forefront of believing that Tavon Austin was going to move dramatically up draft boards, especially after he did all these workouts, his performance at the combine, and everything. But the real question is, should Tavon Austin be a top 10 pick? When you look at Tavon Austin as a prospect, and you wear those goggles of the traditional NFL mentality and the traditional war room mentality, you see a guy that is a playmaker, can bring several different things to your offense and to your football team as a whole. But those concerns about size and durability and not meeting those prototypes would tend to make you say, no, Tavon Austin's a talented player, be a nice role player in the NFL, no question, be a nice guy that brings you some big plays. But he's a guy you would maybe start thinking about later on in the first round, maybe even in the early portion of the second round. And I get that, and it's understandable. It's hard to convince someone, and we all know this in many different walks of life, it's hard to convince someone that times have changed. It's hard to convince someone that they're behind the times, if you will, when they've been doing something for so long, and some individuals have convinced themselves that they're more successful than they really are. They kind of live in their own little bubble, and they don't really want to step outside of that bubble because it takes them outside of their comfort zone. But the NFL game has evolved and it has changed. And in a lot of ways, college football has helped bring about some of these changes in the NFL. It came to college first, and it started spreading to the NFL. As these prospects came from college to the NFL teams said, hey, we got to find ways to put these guys in positions to succeed because they are very talented individuals. So we have to start mirroring what was done with them at college. And that's why you've seen some of the read option. You've seen things like the Wildcat. You've seen different things done over the past several years, to kind of incorporate more of what these college players do well, especially on the offensive side of the football. And when you look at the NFL today, especially offensively, one of the things that I've harped on many occasions is that when you talk about the passing game, it's not anymore all about stretching people out vertically. It's important, first and foremost, to stretch people out horizontally. That is with multiple receiver sets, multiple tight ends, lining running backs out wide, all of those different things. You have to be able now in today's NFL to stretch defenses out horizontally before you're able to go over the top and stretch them out vertically. And that's just the way it is. And when you look at this draft, you see a lot of teams that could definitely benefit from having another weapon, another offensive playmaker, if you will. You've got teams like Philadelphia. You might say, well, they already have Jackson and Macklin. Okay, when you look at the type of system that Chip Kelly might want to run in Philadelphia, what would it hurt to have Tavon Austin? What would it hurt to have another weapon? You're a bad team. You could use help anywhere. And an explosive playmaker like that could do a lot of good. The Detroit Lions, they've spent quite a few mid-round picks in recent years on wide receivers trying to find help for Matthew Stafford and somebody else to take some of the burden off of Calvin Johnson. And they've primarily been unsuccessful at doing so. So bringing in a Tavon Austin, a weapon like him, to take some of the pressure off of Calvin Johnson would make a lot of sense. The Cleveland Browns, you really want to ride with your top two wide receivers being just Josh Gordon and Greg Little? No, you can bring in a Tavon Austin, line him up in the slot. You do a lot of different things, and you've added another element to that Browns offense that's desperately needed. The Buffalo Bills could use somebody on the other side, more of a speed element to complement Stevie Johnson. You could look at the New York Jets. My God, where do I even begin? Their offense is atrocious. And, for all the shit that Mark Sanchez gets, and legitimately so, the bottom line is they have done a piss-poor job since 2009 of surrounding Mark Sanchez with the weapons necessary for him to succeed. And that's just a fact. And it's a shame on that organization. So there are several teams in this draft that could benefit greatly from having a playmaker like Tavon Austin, both at the wide receiver position and as a returner as well. And you look at this being a draft where it lacks elite talent, the all-pro Hall of Fame type guys, but it is very deep. A lot of situations where you could sit there and say, if you're drafting at 10, it's not that much different than drafting at pick 30. And I tend to agree with that in this particular draft. It's a deep draft. It's got good talent. It just lacks star marquee talent. And in that case, a lot of teams should be of the mindset, and I do believe ultimately will be of the mindset, that they need to gamble on upside. They need to gamble on the players with the highest ceilings. Maybe they have some bust potential, but if they work out, they could potentially become all-pros. You want on offense those big-time playmakers. You're willing to take a risk. So I do argue that Tavon Austin should be a top 10 pick in the 2013 NFL Draft. I mean, I don't think he's going to go any farther than, let's say, number 16 to the St. Louis Rams. He could go a few picks early, but I believe he should be a top 10 pick. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean. Now, there are three players that when you see Tavon Austin, he reminds you of to differing levels and capabilities. You've got Deshaun Jackson, Percy Harvin, and Randall Cobb. Those will be three of the most common comparisons you'll hear made when talking about Tavon Austin's game. Now, when we look back at the 2008 draft, Deshaun Jackson was a second-round pick. A second-round pick. And when you look at some of the other players in that draft that were taken in the top 10, you had guys like Glenn Dorsey going 5th overall to the Chiefs. Vernon Gholston going 6th overall to the New York Jets. You had, who else? Cedric Ellis going 7th overall to the Saints. You had Derek Harvey. Oh my God, do I even need to go there? The Jaguars, what the fuck were you thinking? That was a huge trade-up mistake. Keith Rivers going to the Cincinnati Bengals. I ask you this, looking back at it, and we have the benefit of doing that, would you take Deshaun Jackson over a Glenn Dorsey? If you wouldn't, you're either a Cowboy or Giants fan or you're a fucking moron. Would you take him over Keith Rivers, Derek Harvey, Cedric Ellis, Vernon Gholston? Look at what Deshaun Jackson has done in the NFL. Look what he brought to the table. The knocks on him in terms of his size and whatever, they mean nothing now 5 years later. Look at 2009, Percy Harvin. He is a guy, granted, that has had trouble at times staying healthy, but when Percy Harvin is healthy, he's a hell of a playmaker. He brings a lot to your offense, both as a wide receiver and as a return specialist. He was drafted in the 20s back in 2009, and I ask you this. Would you take Percy Harvin over, let's say, an Aaron Curry, who went 4th overall in that draft? Would you take him over a Jason Smith, who went 2nd overall to the Rams? Would you take him over a Tyson Jackson? Would you take him over a Mark Sanchez? Would you take him out over other players at his position? Darius Hayward-Bay, Michael Crabtree, who went 10th overall. Would you take him over Eugene Monroe? I would hope that you fucking would. You know, the only reason Percy Harvin dropped that far was because there were questions about his size and durability. But even with those being known, you'd still take him over all those players I just named if you have any brains in your head at all. You look at Randall Cobb in 2011, a second-round pick. Would you take him over a Jake Locker? Yeah. Would you take him over a Blaine Gabbert? Yeah. The bottom line is when you look at Tavon Austin as a player, there's knocks on him. There's knocks on every player. But when you look at what he can bring to the table, and when you look at the upside that he brings to the table, I think if there are teams that pass on him in that top 10 and he drops down to, let's say, St. Louis at 15, or Carolina takes him at pick 14, or even Tampa Bay takes him at pick 13, in 3 years, a lot of those teams that were picking in the top 10 that had needs that Tavon Austin could have filled are going to be kicking themselves, just like all the teams that passed on Deshaun Jackson and let him fall to the second round in 2008. Just like all the teams that passed on Percy Harvin when he went in the 20s in 2009. Just like all the teams that passed on Randall Cobb in 2011. Yeah, you can say, well, he was a quarterback in Kentucky, Bottom line is, you saw the physical talent and you knew what he could bring to the table. These are guys that if you went back in those drafts now, you would have no problem, I would think, taking them in the top 10. Top 15 for sure, but I would assume, especially over some of the other busts in these different drafts, you would take them over those guys in the top 10. The bottom line is, if NFL teams in the top 10 say, oh, we don't want to take Tavon Austin because he's not big enough, I promise you in 2 or 3 years, they're going to really live to regret that decision.